Okay, here we are in week 11, and tonight we're going to have two lectures as usual. The first lecture, lecture 21, is going to be on the flowering of Africa, and then when we come back from our break, we're going to look, we'll shift northward into Europe, and we'll look at the Vikings and the year 1000. But first we're going to start with Africa, and maybe you could put our title slide on. Okay, oops, sorry, I haven't done my job properly. There. Now we have the flowering of Africa. We've already looked at Africa. We looked at Africa as the cradle of humanity, mankind coming out of Africa and migrating along the coast and to other parts of the world. And we looked at Egypt as one of the very first human civilizations that was in Africa, also in North Africa, along the Mediterranean shore. And as we're going to see, the culture of northern Africa and along the Mediterranean coastline, along the coastline of the Red Sea, and in the Saharan desert, that is quite a different culture than sub-Saharan Africa. But today we're going to look, we've already looked at Egypt, we're going to look at other parts of Africa. And the reason we're doing Africa now at this particular point is because Islam is very important in opening up Africa and connecting it with the rest of the world. So last time we did Islam, and we looked at the expansion of Islam, and if you look at your map here, you see the first expansion is the orange part along North Africa, Egypt, Persia, and then of course the origins were in the yellow part, Arabia. And then the pink part, pink or purple, whatever that is, that expansion was later. And so there's a huge expansion across Africa that really opens up Africa across the Sahara Desert, and it connects it to the Middle Eastern and European world at this point. And it's Islam that's the connector. That's really important to look at. We looked at Islam, the religion of Islam. Here is an Islamic leader among the Bedouins of Arabia, where Islam originated. I think he has a Persian costume on, actually, so this is more representative of later Islam when it's taken over by Persian culture. The Arabic culture is very simple at first, and Islam is eclectic like Christianity is, and absorbs all the other cultures that come in contact with it. And so if we talk about some of the major characteristics of Islam, what is the major characteristics? I would say Persian. The strongest influence is Persian to the Arabic culture. So we can see that in this picture here. Now we're going to turn to Africa, and here is a world map with Africa in the world. Africa is a huge continent, and we'll look at the geography of Africa. It's kind of a difficult continent to penetrate. It's very very remote, and it has remained remote up to the time we're talking about now with the coming of Islam. Okay, this is the world about AD 1300, the areas that were known to the Europeans. And as you can see, only the north coast of Africa was known to the Europeans, but this was going to be changed quite quickly as Africa was opened up and as the Europeans came in contact with Islam. Okay, here is Africa, and we can look at the geographical zones of Africa. We have the orange area that was part of the Roman Empire, which is a Mediterranean kind of climate. It shares the same climate as Italy, for example, the Holy Land, Turkey, a Mediterranean climate. In the 3rd millennium BC, Sumerian records spoke of regular trading contacts between Mesopotamia and the islands of the Persian Gulf, Oman, and the Indus Valley. But these broke off, and later Mesopotamian trade references refer more often to East Africa than to India. So there's a shift from the Indian orientation of the first Sumerian trade. Now the trade goes into Africa. There were migrations from Southeast Asia to Madagascar, and we'll see that in another map in a moment. We might mention the other climatic zones. The yellow part on this map is the Sahara Desert, which is not uncrossable, but it's a great barrier. And then the green area to the south is sub-Saharan Africa. And we're going to be looking mainly at sub-Saharan Africa today. There were migrations from Southeast Asia to Madagascar, and on the southeastern coast of Africa. As you can see, Madagascar is that large island to the south, and of course Malaysia is a peninsula over to your right. I think I have a map later on that shows that. Those migrations were very important. They spread particularly important elements into Africa, in particular bananas, yams, and percussion instruments like the xylophone. And these came from Malaysia, Southeast Asia, through the island of Madagascar, which was settled by Malays. There was a lot of intermarriage on that island. And then those elements of culture were spread to the mainland of Africa and spread throughout Africa. As I said, 2,000 years ago, Southeast Asians established themselves in Madagascar, and settlers farmed the new land and intermarried with Africans who arrived around the 5th century A.D. into Madagascar. The settlers preserved the language and the culture of their homeland, and as I mentioned before, xylophone music, bananas, and yams were Southeast Asian plants that spread to mainland Africa. But interestingly, the memory of their origins faded, so the Africans didn't know where they came from. Modern scholarships have rediscovered these things through linguistic links, through reconstructing the language, and we don't have a lot of written records for Africa. There are very few. And so a lot of what I'm going to tell you today has been reconstructed through archaeological remains, through linguistic investigations, through investigations of technology. And so there are written records that have to do with Africa, but they're largely on the fringes of Africa in other cultures. So it's hard to piece together the early history of Africa before 1500. The only written account of trade in the Indian Ocean is the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek writing that referred to the Red Sea in the 1st century A.D. Okay, here is the trade with Africa that you can see, the Sumerian trade with Africa along the coast and with India, Gulf of Oman, and this is an Egyptian. This is Egypt, of course, that we've already looked at. The Malays to Madagascar. Okay, yes, I knew I had a map with an arrow that showed the Malays going to Madagascar and the elements of it. In the 5th century A.D., the Malays went to Madagascar in 1000 B.C., so it took about 1,500 years for the Africans then to move to Madagascar. So the Malays were there for 1,500 years before the Africans came. And here is Malaysia. The purple peninsula is Malaysia. And these are some of the Malays who we saw spread to the Pacific Islands. And they're the same peoples who settled in Madagascar. Okay. The Greeks in the 1st century A.D. Arrived in that area, and we know about it from a writing called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And the Erythraean Sea is the Greek name for the Red Sea, and you can see Greek influence along there along the coast of the Red Sea and the area that is modern Ethiopia. The Periplus describes ports of call along the Red Sea and down the East African coast to south of Zanzibar. then South Arabia and the Persian Gulf, and India, and around the continent to the mouth of the Ganges. And so it links together, this Greek work links together all these places so that we know Greek trade was carried out with Africa and Asia in those areas. It's an eyewitness account of the trading system inspired by the demand for products. And the products of Africa were very large in this trading network. For example, Africa contributed exotic animals, wood, ivory. From Somalia, the frankincense and myrrh were in great demand. Something called Socotra, which was dragon's blood, a scarlet resin used for pigment in painting and dyes. Pearls abounded in the Persian Gulf, and there were ancient copper mines in Oman on the south of Arabia. In India, spices and manufactured goods were traded for these African products, and spices and manufactured goods also came from Southeast Asia. Into this trading network, from as far away as China, there appeared pottery, and so you can see that there was widespread trading connection. The culture of the ports was often isolated from the hinterland, and so this is a culture that's confined to the seacoast and does not penetrate to the interior of the country. Largely that's because of the desert and the high mountain barriers in Africa. The only parallel to the maritime culture of the Greeks and the Phoenicians is Srivijaya that we've talked about in Southeast Asia. Okay, and here are, I've just said all of these things. By the Islamic era of the 8th century AD, Eastern products were well known in the Middle East. Javanese and Indian communities were established in Mesopotamia. Here's a Greek ship plying that route. Javanese and Indian communities were established in Mesopotamia, and an Arab expedition had conquered the lower Indus Valley. And here again you see these trading networks connected. There was a large colony of Arab and Persian traders growing up in southern China, linking together all of these places. Hindu gods were found in caves in southeast Iran, and Arab families lived in Singapore and Jakarta at that time. So that we have this huge trading network linking together India and Asia and Arabia to the coast of Africa, but the Sahara isolated sub-Saharan Africa from the Mediterranean world. And if you look, I didn't put that range of mountains there, but if you look at that big lake at the source of the Nile River, that is a mountain range that blocks the incursion of the coastal settlements that we've just been talking about. Okay, Africa, unfortunately, suffered from not ever being invaded and conquered. And this was a bad thing, that it was never invaded and conquered, because all these cultures we've looked at that invade and conquer each other, they exchange knowledge, they exchange products, they exchange technology, they exchange learning, and each one enriches the other. And so Africa was a bit unfortunate in that it had a geography that was difficult to penetrate, and so it did not enjoy conquests to give it infusions of more culture. The Sahara, and here we see again some of these, here I have on this map the trading routes that I've been telling you about, tying all of these places together. Okay. The Sahara isolated sub-Saharan Africa from the Mediterranean world. The current dryness dates to about 2500 BC. But in that Saharan region, there were prehistoric paintings in Saharan rock art suggesting the origins of sub-Saharan African peoples actually in the deserts of the Sahara. There were pastoral cattle herders, and there were detailed scenes of daily life in these rock paintings. They may have migrated southward as the Sahara continually dried out. The cattle herders in the Sahara Desert were succeeded by horse herders, and we can tell about this from the dramatic changes in art that became more sketchy and geometric. And we see the appearance in the rock art of the Sahara of these horse herders of chariots, which suggest Mediterranean origins of the horse herders and the chariots. So who was it who had horses and chariots? You remember? No, those of you who got A's on your exam for the midterm. The horses were domesticated by the Indo-Europeans, remember, and they were brought into the Mediterranean and the Middle Eastern era by the Indo-Europeans. So this suggests the Indo-Europeans also entered the Sahara Desert, and that these settlers, these horse herders, may have been Indo-European. Perhaps they were refugees from the Mycenaean or Minoan collapse. They might have actually been Greeks. Here's the spread of Islam in the 8th century that opens up this era. Okay. And here on this map we can see the Sahara Desert, where the rock art is in the yellow area in the Sahara Desert. The first settlers being pastoral, cattle herding nomads, followed by horse herders. Okay. And these are the climactic ranges of Africa. The orange belt south of the Sahara is a more moderate, almost a Mediterranean type climate, and below it is a green belt that the light green is more humid, but it's more like plains and light humidity. The dark green part is very tropical and very humid with lots of rainfall. So you can see the different climatic zones of Africa here on this map. Well, back to the sub-Saharan trade. The coming of the camel made a huge difference. It was brought by the Muslims. It was brought by the Arabs from Arabia into the Sahara Desert. It made a tremendous change in the way that people could cultivate, or not cultivate, but settle in the desert. Saharan trade and the spread of camel domestication developed together. So it was the camel that was the key to developing Saharan trade and enabling people to travel across the desert. The highland rock art implies camel riders in desert costumes as the last Saharan population, and these would have been the ancestors of the Berbers that are there in the Sahara today. A cruder, more elementary art takes over. Latin texts from the 1st century BC first mention camels in North Africa because camels are native to Arabia, and so they were brought there by Islam. They first came into use in Egypt in the 1st millennium BC, but it was really, again, the Muslims who spread the camels into the Sahara Desert and opened it up for exploitation. Evidence of a south to north diffusion comes from the design of camel saddles. And again, you know, we have to deal with, we don't have written sources, so we have to deal with archaeological and material sources of various kinds. There are 2 designs of saddles that are used in the Sahara Desert. The northern design of saddles was used by traders who dismount to fight. They get off of their camels and they use their camels as shields as they fight behind the camels. There's a southern design of saddle that is different, and those saddles are for fighting on horseback with a sword and spear. And so we have 2 different designs of saddle, and we know that there are 2 different cultures in the Sahara Desert. The Berbers of the Sahara adopted the saddling technology of Rome's Middle Eastern provinces. The camel was primarily a work animal pulling plows and carts, and that's still evident in Tunisia today, and this is true in the northern part of the Sahara, that camels were used as work animals, while the Berbers of the South Sahara were nomads and cattle herders who were warriors. Okay, so we have a different kind of Berber culture in the north, which is more attuned to the agricultural land along the shores of the Mediterranean, while in the South Sahara you have a nomadic warrior culture, and so quite a different culture in that region. Okay. There's trade between the two people in the north and south of the Sahara, both of them being Berbers, and that began with salt from the southern desert to South Africa. Okay, let's just look for a minute at, here is a Bedouin stealing a bride, and this one is on horseback. The horses, of course, were part of that culture. And here are some scenes of the Sahara. This is the oasis of Siwa in the Sahara, and you can see the desert all around this. The Sahara is an extremely desolate desert with little dots of oases from place to place where people could go as a base for trade, and so they would have camel caravans going from one oasis to another. Trade began between the two peoples, the Berbers of the north and the Berbers of the south, with salt. So salt was the first item of trade. Here's the Mediterranean origin of the chariot, Mycenaean or Minoan collapse, the chariot, as we see in that culture. Here's a group of Bedouins in that region. We've already said this. Latin texts of the 1st century BC mention camels in North Africa. Okay, there are two kinds of camels. Arabian camels have one hump, and Bactrian camels from the area between Persia and India have two humps, and both of them are shown in this particular picture. Okay, and here's the Roman Empire. All right, we've already talked about this. Trade began with salt from the Mediterranean between the Berbers of the North and the South Sahara, and they traded with the Tuareg people of the highlands in Algeria, Niger, and Mali. And you can see Mali on that map. It's just in the orange zone, as we have moderate temperatures bordering on the more humid tropical areas of southern Africa. Traders from the equatorial forest zone, which would have been the light green part there, brought forest products, and also the dark green zone, cola nuts, palm oil, and traded that for coastal products, and the trade took place in that orange zone we can see on the map. Roman North Africa supplied Italy with wheat and olives and wild animals, and that's the green area right along the seacoast of the Mediterranean. Carthage, which right there, it actually has a white hole in it in that picture, but Carthage is right where that spit of land goes out near Sicily. But Carthage was rebuilt. Hippo in North Africa along the coast, and Leptis Magna, which is in modern-day Libya, were centers of exchange. And the northern culture in that green area along the coast and spreading farther inland was Roman in essence during Roman times. The coming of Islam changed all of this. Okay, and here we have the Roman Empire, and here you can see where Carthage is. That's that green area on that map. This is from our map of our history of the Roman Empire, where we see Roman culture taking over the North Mediterranean. Okay, see, Leptis Magna is right there where it says Ptolemaic Empire. Leptis Magna is about there in modern-day Libya. Okay, we don't have Hippo on that map. It's around the same region. Okay, Hannibal crossing the Alps, of course, came from, and there we have Carthage, the green part of Carthage there. Hannibal crossing the Alps came from Carthage in Africa, and they colonized Spain, and he brought elephants, of course, to cross the Alps to invade the Roman Republic, if you recall. And here is the Roman Empire, which you can see comprises the northern coast of Africa, which is a major part of the Roman Empire, ringing around the Sea of the Mediterranean. And this is Rome. Okay, here is ancient Utica, so that there would have, remembered that there were Roman cities all over the Roman Empire, and every city looked pretty much like every other city. And this is certainly true of the North African coast, where we have, you can see the Roman Empire along that coast, and the cities along that coast would have looked like this as well. There are many ruins that look exactly like this, with a Colosseum and a theater and a forum and all of the trappings of Roman culture. And so that it was very strong along the north coast of the Sahara Desert of Africa. Here are the forums of the emperor, again, would have been in every city. So the coming of Islam in Africa in the 7th and the 8th century really changed Africa quite dramatically. With the coming of Islam, the direction of trade shifted to the Middle East. With the Roman Empire, the direction of trade was north to south. Now the direction shifted to east to west in the 7th century AD. The trans-Mediterranean trade ended, so there's no longer trade across the Mediterranean with Europe. And the east-west overland trade grew, and here's where the camels come in, and so that they direct the trade across the Sahara Desert. The Arabs and the Berbers felt a lot of kinship because the camel culture unified them, and the Berber and Arab culture is quite similar because it's a rather primitive, nomadic culture sharing many of the same elements, and so there's a kinship that the Berbers felt for the Arabs because they had a similar culture. But a series of Berber revolts against Arab rule began from 740 onward. And what happened was that North Africa, and here's the expansion of Islam, as you can see across North Africa. And here are some representations of Islam. Here is a mullah calling to prayer, and here is a camel with a caravan on the right. Okay, again, our Islamic culture that becomes more and more Persian. The trans-Mediterranean trade ended, and the Arabs and the Berbers shared this camel culture. There were Berber revolts from 740 onward, and when they revolted from Islamic control, small local principalities were set up in Morocco and Algeria, and these were Sijil Massa and Tahert. Okay, these are the two states. You see Sijil Massa in the west and Tahert in the east. Tahert is about in the area of modern Libya, and Sijil Mana was in the area of modern Algeria and Morocco. Okay. And they began, instead of looking eastward with the eastward network they had built, they began looking southward to the southern nomads. And remember, we have two kinds of Berber culture. We have a northern culture and a southern culture. Now there's a reconnection between those cultures. And the reason is gold. Okay, gold was discovered in Niger, in the Niger River, and this became a magnet for the traders across the Sahara Desert. The gold of the Niger River was traded for salt and copper from the north, and then and this discovery then instituted a huge new trading network. New trading links were forged with sub-Saharan Africa, and Sijil Massa and Tahert became wealthy and actually minted gold coins. Okay, now at this point we discover the earliest known kingdom of Africa in the west, and this is the kingdom of Ghana, linked to that Saharan trade. Okay, here we see I don't know why I have that map here, but Ghana is in that orange area south of the Sahara. Okay. The earliest known sub-Saharan beneficiary of the new trade route was the Kingdom of Ghana, and you can see Ghana on this map, and the trade routes are drawn in red across the Sahara. Ghana inaugurates the documentable political history of West Africa. For the first time, we have written documents that we can actually use to document what's going on in West Africa, and these are from the mid-11th century A.D. The Soninke people lived in parts of Mali, Mauritania, and Senegal, and these were the people that populated Ghana. The king required the sons of vassal kings to attend his court, so he was an over-king who had a number of vassal kings, and the over-king meted out justice and controlled trade and collected the taxes on copper and salt. And he actually had a large army of bowmen and cavalry. The power of Ghana extended to Adaghost, a trade entrepot in the desert, and there you can see Adaghost, which is the end of that left-hand trading route, the red trading route, and that is part of Ghana, that city. It was a trade entrepot in the desert where Arabs and Berbers met Ghanaians or sub-Saharan Africans. But in 1076, Ghana fell to a new state formed by the desert nomads, the Muslim Almoravids, who ruled from the city of Marrakesh in the north. And you can see Marrakesh on the north in that map, in the orange area, that then spread south and conquered Ghana to the south. The Ghana people at that time converted partially to Islam, or at least they tolerated it. We're not sure how far they converted. And eventually Ghana regained its independence but never recovered its former greatness. So we have evidence of the first state being formed in Ghana in sub-Saharan Africa in the west part of Africa. But this was balanced by the growth of Saharan desert states. And so we see the rise of new and powerful states as the result of trade in the Saharan desert. Okay, let's turn to looking at sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. We're going to look at the entire continent. Here is Ghana and Mali, Mauritania and Awadost to the north. Okay. Sub-Saharan Africa shares a common culture throughout the entire region of the continent. The most important African network of cultural exchange took place from 300 AD to 1100 AD, and it led to the formation of enduring characteristics of African culture, and this is a shared culture all over sub-Saharan Africa. The geography of Africa stretches over 80 degrees of latitude and in dramatically different environments. We've already looked at the Sahara Desert in the north. Well, of course, we have the coastline. The Mediterranean climate is orange. The desert is yellow. The semi-arid steppes of the Sahel region, which again is orange, it's almost a Mediterranean climate. The tropical savanna covered by long grasses and scattered forest in the light green area. The dark green area is the tropical rainforest on the lower Niger and in the Zaire Basin. There are broad expanses of savannas in the light green areas, and there are more steppes and deserts as you move southward in the Kalahari, the yellow desert to the south, and temperate highlands in the very extreme at the southern extremity to the south. Okay. This whole region, even though it is very geographically diverse, still it shared a cultural heritage. And this is called the Great Tradition of Africa. Okay, they shared a common written language, common legal and belief systems, common ethical codes and intellectual traditions, and these common ties, these common characteristics that they have, rise above the diversity of local customs and beliefs, so that in all different areas of Africa there were different customs in local areas, but this sort of core of customs bound them all together. The cultural unity of sub-Saharan Africa was especially complex due to the long periods of isolation from other cultures. And if we could, we're looking now in 300 AD to 1100 AD. We're looking at the very last part of our time period that we're studying in civilization. So you can see how long Africa was isolated, and different areas of Africa remained in isolation even in the period when this culture was spreading throughout Africa. There's a lot of isolation within Africa because it was so difficult for conquerors to conquer it because of the geography, the high mountains, the thick forests, the dense rainforests, and the broad savannas that were hard to cross. And so, as I said, Africa suffered because there were no invaders who could conquer this very difficult geography. There are 2,000 different languages spread throughout Africa, 2,000 distinct languages with distinct customs and rituals. There are numerous food production systems. For example, the hunting and gathering by the Mabuti Pygmies, which was different from the Khoisan desert people. And both of them were hunting and gathering peoples, but their customs were quite different. It was a different kind of hunting and gathering. There were pastoral societies where they would herd animals of different kind, and these were likewise diverse. We have Dinka cattle herders, which were unlike the Fulani herders, and the camel herders the Fulani herders actually were camel herders. The Somalis differed from the Tuareg, who raised horses. So there were a lot of nomadic peoples, but they all raised different animals, and they had quite different customs. A third group of cultures were agriculturalists, and so they raised different crops in different ways. So we're talking about a vast amount of diversity in Africa. Agriculturists range from banana, yam, and root cultivators to grain growers, which would be quite different cultures from each of these crops. And so, so you have a huge amount of diversity throughout Africa. Nevertheless, there were broad commonalities. There are Pan-African cultural patterns that are called Africanity. Okay, in kingship has a common feature all over Africa. One of the common features is the ritual isolation of the king, and so that he is kept apart from the common people. The societies share in common age groupings and fixed kinships divisions, so that the society was divided along lines of age and along lines of kinship. And also along gender lines, there were distinct gender roles and relations. Divisions were made according to occupational groupings, so that farmers would have been different from miners, for example, so that occupational groupings would have separated people into different groups. Where kings ruled, there were nobles, commoners, and slaves as a three-layer society. There's a common music and dance tradition in Africa that spreads all over Africa and is shared by all the different cultures. Music is with rhythm instruments of various kinds. We mentioned the xylophone, which was brought from Malaysia. There are drums and there are rhythm instruments of all different kinds. and with music and dance, there were common rituals of mask wearing, which is very important all over Africa. In agriculture, the technology is the same all over Africa. They use a hoe and they dig the ground rather than plowing. They don't have a plow and they don't plow the ground. They dig it with a hoe, and this is common all over Africa. The differences among the African cultures are quite like the differences between the Greeks, the Persians, and the Hittites, who are all Indo-Europeans, and yet they have a very different culture, but they share the Indo-European core culture of, and we'll come back to that when we look at the Vikings, but there's an Indo-European core culture of the elected king and the senatorial, or if you want to call them a council of elders who are governing, and the assembly of all free warriors. And the Greeks, the Persians, and the Hittites all have that core Indo-European culture. The same is true of Africa, and each of these African cultures having the characteristics we've just outlined. Okay, here are the temples and palaces of Philae at the head of the first cataract of the Nile, and this culture this area would have been part of the kingdom of Cush, next to Egypt, which was very Egyptian in culture, but it had the common African characteristics of Africanity. And here you can see the Emperor Theodore of Ethiopia giving an audience surrounded by lions. I like this picture. And so Ethiopia would have also shared, Ethiopia, which is oriented toward the Red Sea, and the Arabian culture shared this common culture. The Nubians to the south of Egypt, as we get into sub-Saharan Africa, would have shared this culture. And as we get into the deep forests, and here's a village in the deep forest, they would have shared this culture as well. Okay, and here's another area of the forest. Okay, getting into the more tropical areas of Africa, and their warrior culture here, here we have a percussion instrument. To the left, you see an African playing a drum, and this would have been the one of the percussion instruments common all over Africa. To the right are spear throwers who engaged in a war, which were common in Africa. There were a lot of wars. Here's a bowman. I'm sorry, this is hunting, the hunting culture, which was shared through several cultures. It's a little bit blurry, but here is a bowman hunting with a bow and arrow. You can see the animals on the left, and this is a city, okay, on the same artifact. But all of them would have shared that common African culture. Now, the advent of iron caused a great change in African culture. It began the Bantu migrations. Agriculture became common north of the equator and spread southward, displacing the hunting and gathering as a way of life. So we see the spread of agriculture. Banana trees, meanwhile, made their way north from Madagascar. So we have moving south agricultural traditions, and moving northward the cultivation of bananas, moving to the north and to the west, and they meet in forming an agricultural society. Meanwhile, copper mining spread from the Sahara that began the first millennium BC. That spread to the Niger Valley in Central Africa, and the Niger Valley is, if you can see on that map, it's about in the middle, actually. Well, it's not in the middle. It's right near where Mali is. It's to the east of Mali. Okay. Copper mining spread to the Niger Valley and then to Central Africa, and gold mining in Zimbabwe was being done by the 8th and 9th centuries AD, and then Zimbabwe is in that southern light green area if you look to the south of Africa. There was iron smelting in the North Sub-Saharan Africa in the first millennium BC, and then it spread southward. The iron smelting originated with the Hittites of Anatolia in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, around 1500 BC, and apparently spread southward with the Bantu language in Africa. How iron smelting reached Africa is not really clear, but the original iron smelting was actually done by the Indo-Europeans and the Hittites. Okay. Now, the languages spread along with the Bantu migration and the advent of iron. Here's the Hittite prince hunting deer, and this would have been in modern-day Turkey, Anatolia, and they're the first smelters of iron. Okay. Here is the movement of crops and metallurgy techniques. You see, agriculture is the green area that's spreading from the north to the south. Bananas are moving, they were brought from Malaysia, they're moving from Madagascar to the north and the west. Copper mining is moving from the northwest into the central area, and gold mining is in Zimbabwe. It's got a pink circle around it. Okay? Everybody oriented to where all of these technologies are going? All right, now, the other spread is of the Bantu language, and this is the common language that links all of Africa together. It's of the Niger-Congo family of languages, and it spread from Senegal to the south. Most of the people of sub-Saharan Africa speak the language that speak languages belonging to the Niger-Congo family. They spread from the Senegal River in the north to South Africa, and the Senegal River is, if you can see on that map where it says Bantu near the Niger River, can you see where Bantu is? Everybody see where that is? Okay, that's where the arrows start to go southward on the map. Okay. 300 languages south of the equator are Bantu, and that is a subgroup of the Niger-Congo family of languages. Bantu began at the equator and spread both north and south. The homeland is near the boundary of modern Nigeria and Cameroon, and so it's where the Niger River is. That's where it is. It says Bantu right there. It's near the known sites of early iron smelting, so it appears that the Bantu languages spread along with iron smelting. Proto-Bantu was the original language, and the Proto-Bantu people engaged in fishing and used canoes and nets and lines and hooks. The Proto-Bantu people lived in sedentary villages on the edge of the rainforest, and they grew yams and grains and harvested wild oil palms. They domesticated goats, dogs, and perhaps other animals, and they made pottery and cloth and used iron axes and iron hoes. These practices are the source of Pan-African tradition. So you can say the core culture of Africa is the Bantu culture that originated these core customs that spread all over Africa. Okay. Now, we see the rise of a series of black African kingdoms in both the east and the west of Africa. And I've outlined these kingdoms here. We'll look at them on a map in a moment. Kush is the African kingdom that emerged in the 8th century BC. It lasted until the 4th century AD. Its capital was Meroe, and it was just south of Egypt, in fact. The script they wrote, they actually had writing. It was alphabetic writing. They used the alphabet that they had gotten from the Greeks and the Phoenicians, but we cannot read that writing, and so they left written records, but we can't read them. It was a partner and rival to the pharaohs in the Red Sea trade. It rivaled Egypt, and it was connected with the Greeks and the Romans and strongly influenced by Egypt. Very many of the customs of Egypt were practiced in Kush, and it's almost a mirror image of the Egyptian culture in the customs that they had. Axum is another of these kingdoms, and here's the Queen of Abyssinia, and so this would have been actually Ethiopia, would have been the region where the Queen of Abyssinia is today, the area that was ancient Ethiopia. Let me go to our map. Okay, Kush is in the Sudan, and it's just south of Egypt. South of Kush is Ethiopia. Kush is the blue part of that map. Ethiopia is the pink part. Now let me go back to our notes, and we'll look at each of these kingdoms. I'll be switching back and forth between the map and the notes. Axum was an Ethiopian city founded by Arab immigrants in the 1st century A.D. By the 300s A.D., it was challenging Kush for control of the Red Sea, and by 350, it conquered Kush, which then declined and disappeared. So Ethiopia became, or Axum as it was called then, became the primary kingdom around in the 300s. Its rise was concurrent with the conversion to Byzantine Christianity, and so Christianity reached into that area. It was a Christian kingdom. Coptic Christians are now the oldest surviving Christian sect, and have I mentioned to you that there's actually a Coptic church here in Houston, in Bel Air, at St. Mark's Coptic Church, and you can go there and you'll be right back in 4th century Ethiopia. It's the same religion that was practiced there. It's really interesting to go there. And this is now the oldest surviving sect of Christianity from this area of Ethiopia. The physical isolation of Ethiopia helped to hold off Islam. Also, in Ethiopia, there were earlier Jewish immigrants, and there's a legend that the Jews brought the Holy of Holies at the fall of Jerusalem to Ethiopia, and large numbers, to this day in modern times, large numbers of Ethiopian Jews are accepted in Israel as descendants of the Hebrews. The royal line of Axum is said to be descended from Menelik in the Bible. Okay, Menelik was the son of the Hebrew king Solomon. The prosperity of Axum was tied to the Red Sea trade, but Islam cut that off, and once Islam spread into the Mediterranean, Axum sunk into oblivion. So let's go to our map, and you can see Ethiopia, which is landlocked and sort of inland, cut off by the Muslim trade along the coast as Islam spread to the west. Okay. Now we're going to move to the west again and look at the successors to Ghana. We talked about Ghana as the first of the African states. It was Mali, which you can see on that map as a little bit east of Ghana. Mali replaced Ghana, which fell to the Berbers of the north in the 11th century. Okay, remember that Ghana was conquered by the Berber kingdom to the north, and now Mali arose from 1200 to 1450 AD. Okay, let's go back to our notes. You see where Mali is on the map. Oops, wrong one. Okay. Nubia replaced Axum. I forgot to mention Nubia replaced Axum. There were several transitory kingdoms in Nubia. They converted to Christianity from Egypt in the 7th to the 8th century, and then they converted to Islam in the 12th century. But little is known about Axum. We've already talked about the rise of Ghana. Sorry, I skipped this a little bit. Ghana lasted for 2 centuries, from the 8th century AD to the 10th century AD. It grew up with the good soils along the Niger River. It had a capital named Kombi, and Arabic and Berber Muslims were very influential. The Ghanaians were originally animists. They worshipped gods that were in objects and of nature of various kinds. They converted to Islam. And one of the reasons they converted was it helped their trade. The merchants wanted to be Islamic because they could enter the trading network of the Sahara. The law and administration of Ghana were from the Koran. Okay, now I'm back to where I was before. Mali then replaced Ghana, which fell to the Berbers in the 11th century. We've already looked at the falling of Ghana to the Berbers to the north. Okay. Mali then arose on the ashes of Ghana, and it was larger and better organized than Ghana. Mali had a sacred king who ruled with the help of chieftains, and in the 13th century it converted to Islam. It had a strategic trading position on the south fringe of the Sahara, and it profited from taxes. And let's go to our map again. Here you can see Mali on the fringe, the south fringe of the Sahara. It profited from the taxes on gold, salt, and slaves. And Mali was the gold source for Europe and the Mediterranean. It was the only place they had to get gold, and so it was very important linking together Europe and the Mediterranean. Interesting, remember that we said when we looked at Islam, we noted that slavery was a very large part of Islam, and still is to this day, that slavery was an important component condoned by Islam. And this is true in Africa, too, that slavery, as Islam spread, slavery became very important in Islamic Africa. There were large numbers of slaves that passed from sub-Saharan Africa northward to the Mediterranean and the Muslim world, feeding into that Muslim slave trading network. Mali itself expanded by military conquests in the 13th century until it dominated most of West Africa, and in fact Mali dominated the yellow area on this map. It was an empire in Western Africa comprising that whole southwestern, well, I don't know if you want to call it south, but western area. They expanded by military conquest, and the most important and most famous ruler was Mansa Musa, who ruled from 1307 to 1332. There was a huge empire. They had 8 million people that spread from Morocco to Timbuktu. Okay, but it too faded and disappeared. It was replaced by the Songhai Empire, and let me go back to our notes. It was replaced to the Songhai Empire, which we know absolutely nothing about. We know that it existed, it replaced Mali, and there it is. Okay, so that we don't know what it is. Now, again, there's such a dearth of written records that everything is quite spotty, that we just know little bits and pieces about Africa from one piece to another. So let's move southward to two great states that we know very little about, but we know they existed, and more is being discovered through archaeological investigations. Again, they had no written language, and so we don't have written records, but we have archaeological records. Here's the Queen of Abyssinia again, and here is our map again. Okay, the Swahili city-states were in the area that is the orange area right here to the south. Okay, they were preceded by Indian and Roman trade and began again with Muslim settlers who were the Swahili area is the green area. That's the Swahili area. It began with Muslim settlers who were merchants, and Arabs and Bantus intermarried along that coast in the green area. Persian and Indonesian merchants mixed in, so we have a great diversity of peoples along that coast. It's a melting pot culture that was tied together by Islam, and Islam is what caused the fusion of all of those cultures together. The culture and language is called Swahili, and it is a mixed Bantu and Arabic language. Again, there was a very extensive slave trade to the Muslim lands, and the major ports were Mombasa and Kilwa and Mogadishu, which are marked on that map that you can see along the green area there. The Portuguese of the 15th century discovered it and were amazed at its wealth and its opulence. And what we know about the Swahili city-states of this area is largely through the Portuguese going there and describing what they found in the 15th century. So that's most of what we know about the African state in this early time before 1500. Let's go back to our notes again. Okay, the Swahili city-states, and there you have the spellings for the three great cities, Mombasa, Kilwa, and Mogadishu along that coast. Okay. The next African state of the south that we're going to look at is Great Zimbabwe, which is in South Africa. And this is interesting because it's a great state that grew up in a moderate climate with very good soil. In the 700s, the Bantu-speaking migrants arrived, and let's just go to our map here, and Zimbabwe is the orange region in the south. In the 700s, the Bantu-speaking migrants arrived, and in the 5th century, preceding the Bantu-speaking people, ironworking arrived. So again, the Bantu language and ironworking are spreading virtually together. But agriculture did not replace hunting until 1500 AD. Nevertheless, a great city was built in the 10th to the 11th century by the kings, but only ruins remain. And so we have the ruins of that city, but no written records, so we can't tell anything about it. We just know that it flourished as a cultural and a trading center, and then it disappeared. And the cause of its demise is unknown because we just don't know that much about it. Okay, we've done a quick survey of all of Africa, a huge continent, and somebody has a tired hand from writing. We have a few moments for questions or comments, if any of you. Here's a question.
Yeah, I went to the Museum of Fine Arts and I noticed the African gold exhibit of, I think it was a Khan.
Could you say that louder, please?
The tribe of the African gold exhibit was Akan, A-K-A-N. I was just curious of where that was at. Is it like in Ghana? Or?
Yes, that's the region where the gold came from, virtually all of Africa. Yeah, I'm glad you went to the Museum of Fine Arts. They have a really good exhibit. Another place where they have an excellent exhibit of African art, and actually I have some pictures of African art. I forgot I have them. Is the Menil collection. The Menil collection is an absolutely wonderful collection of African art. It was one of Dominique de Menil's hobbies to collect African art, and it's exquisite. Here's some African art. This is an ivory carving that I have in a book of ivory carvings, and I think it shows some of the characteristics of African peoples. It shows some of the qualities of their art, and this is a very fine piece with very realistic representations, along with characteristic patternized African art that you can see, animals around the top, and a kind of zigzag patternizing along the side. This is a drinking horn. It's an ivory, again, from the Guinea coast in West Africa, and I've already shown you some of the images from this drinking horn when I was illustrating both hunting and the cities, and this would have been the kind of hunting and gathering that goes on with the growth of the city-states. For example, in Mogadishu, we have a representation of a city-state. This is African art that I actually took in our Center for African American Studies. It's modern, but it has the characteristics common to African art. African art is very sophisticated. It differs in all different parts of Africa, but this is quite characteristic, I think, of African art. Here's another. This was an African man with a long beard, and here's an African woman. Again, distinctive African art. This is a man carrying a vessel of some kind on his head. I don't know if that's a mask or a vessel, but remember we said masks were very important. And this is Africa in the world with its connection to the rest of the world. I think that's the last slide I have. Yeah, that's the last slide. And any more questions or comments? Yeah.
Do you know much about the theories surrounding the Proto-Bantu people, this trading with the South Americans?
No, I don't know that theory at all. The Bantu people trading with the South Americans? What do you know about
They
it?
still sail across. There's a book about it called They Came Before Columbus.
Really? Really? Who wrote the book?
I can't recall his name. I can bring the book next class.
Bring it. I haven't heard of it before, but you know, these books pop up from time to time. There's a book, and again, I don't know the author either, a book about the Chinese sailing to South America because of artifacts that are found in South America that resemble Chinese, very ancient artifacts. So there's a theory that the Chinese went to South America too, and they're. From time to time, you'll see books like that appear. You have to be a bit careful with it and check out the author and see what his credentials are, his academic credentials are, because anyone can write a book. But you want to find out who wrote it and where he studied and if he's a respected scientist and if he did his research. I have never heard of the Bantus going to South America, but that doesn't mean they didn't go. Just because I haven't heard of it. So check it out. Remember to check it out. The Internet is the great deceiver. If you go on the Internet and you find things, they can be true or false or made up on the spot. You don't know what you're getting there. So again, be very careful and check your sources. Check your sources.
I read it for a history class at LSU. But
you read it for a history class at
yes,
LSU? Oh, that's interesting. Oh, well, bring the book and let's take a look at it. Let's take a look at it. And this is something that we have to be aware of in our next lecture. We're going to look at the Vikings, who are very exotic and very popular on the webs, on the World Wide Web, and so you're going to find all kinds of Viking sites on the web, and a lot of them are very imaginative, let me put it that way. But there are also very respected scholars who study the Vikings, and there's quite a lot of information that can be gleaned from what they do, and we can sort out the fact from fiction. Okay. And again, the thing to do is to pay attention to your sources and what scientists or historians wrote the articles and what their credentials are, to be sure that they're reliable and that you can get good facts from them. Okay, well, let's take about a 15-minute break, and then we'll move northward again into Northern Europe. I can't say there's any connection between Africa and the Vikings, except that they're kind of simultaneous. So we'll talk about Viking culture moving into Europe at the same time that African culture is developing. And eventually we're going to hook all of these cultures up together at the end of the course. Okay, see you after the break.